The Geller Field's hum stuttered beneath my boots and then shifted, as if some vast, sleeping thing had taken a breath and not exhaled. The light on the bridge thinned, the lamps stayed stubbornly on, but their edges went soft, like someone had scrubbed the world with an old rag. Through the viewport, the stars smeared inward, not moving but breathing, slow, wet, until the runes and course marks wavering on the helms hollow washed into something that wanted to be alive. And then, where the navigator's voice should have braided itself through the machines and the bone-deep noise of the field, there was only a line of absence. Silence answered our calls. We had trusted that voice for years. It was not a pleasant voice. It lived under dental clamps and behind lattice-like eyes. It spoke in sideways visions and cold bargains, and it kept whatever monstrous geometry we carried from tearing the ship apart. But trust is a thin thing on a bridge full of men and women who have to eat and sleep and render decisions. In 100 little ways, we had outsourced our terror to that organ in the navigator's chamber. Course corrections, anticipations, the halting of a ship that wanted to slither into the teeth of the warp. Without it, the ship was a blind thing with teeth and no sense of its own mouth. Instruments twitched like insects on a hot night. The helm boomed a small, anxious beat, a sensor chirp that had no follow-through. The course feed collapsed into static, not the sudden clean loss of a destroyed node, but the slow unravel of a fabric. Latitudes smeared into improbable lines, vectors leaning into impossible arcs. Consoles glowed with partial data, segments of stars annotated with decimals and ghost scores, and then those lights went mute as if dazed. The bridge smelled of ion and the wax of recycled oil. It felt like being in a throat where the voice had been swallowed whole. "Readings," I said. My voice carried without being proud of itself. It was a small, threadbare authority. The crew leaned toward it, the way people lean toward anything to hold shape in a moment that threatens to unmake them. A helmsman with hands like old ropes kept his palms on a dead wheel and stared into the schematics as if looking hard enough might cough up the missing bits. The comms officer's hand hovered over the astropathic relay, but did not close in. Even the ship's steward, who had nothing to do with stars and everything to do with rations, had gone still near the rebreathers. The astropath finally answered. He did not speak as you or I would. His voice came like a scrape of glass across memory. He coughed out fragments, half-phrases that labored like a man moving through molasses. Names warped into something else. Signal, fragmented, blind, he said. Void where sight should be. Navigators, chamber, does not return. His hands fluttered as if pushing down something that wanted to climb out of his mouth. The translation he offered was not a map, but a bruise, and it landed in the arch center of the bridge with the solidity of a wound. There are syntaxes that do not belong in an emergency, but we learned them early. You measure fear in seconds, not in words. I felt the crew's breaths sharpen into an insect chorus. No one laughed. No one played at bravado. The navigator's chamber answered every call with nothing. That phrase is blunt, it is meant to be. The chamber, an organarium of bone, glass, and sanctified metal, was meant to be a mirror into the warp. It reflected safely, with careful compromise. When it did not answer, you felt the absence like a missing limb. The ship's charts presented a blank at the heart of our route, a hole in the map with edges that pulsed. I moved to the viewport and put my hands against the cold glass. It did not help to touch the stars. They were only light moving on a long clock. I watched the hollows on the table, those lines and knots that had been my life for longer than I cared to admit, and I tried to feel for the rhythm of them. Tactility has a way of convincing you that you have things under control. My fingers left warmth at the places where consoles met flesh. Someone behind me whispered a prayer that sounded like a child's plea, and then tried to smother it into an oath. We had not been given any rituals that answered this. The bridge computer offered up its usual redundancies: inertial compensators, dampers, emergency anchoring. They hummed to life because that was what they were designed to do. That hum was comforting in a bland way, the way a stitched wound looks promisingly neat. But there is a difference between a machine's dutiful noise and the living geometry a navigator draws through the warp. Our dampers could hold a ship until morning in a calm tide. They could not steer us through the hungry sinews between stars. They were a blanket over a bleeding thing. I saw the helmsman, near to trembling. He mouthed the numbers he had been trained to speak and found them unanchored. We began to triangulate with whatever instruments kept being stubbornly alive. The long-range arrays gave us signatures, long-bone emissions, and spindles where other ships had been, and we tried to assemble a patchwork route. It felt like sewing a new sail in the dark. The math was there, the faith was not. An automatic route correction suggested itself on the console, a conservative arc that would buy time but would not guarantee safety. It would thread us around the region of worst turbulence, but we would be drifting in the warp for longer than was comfortable. I could order the course and hope the ship did not pass into some bad geometry, or I could hold and try to wake the navigator. To hold meant waiting for a voice that might never return. It felt like sitting on the edge of a cliff with other people and tying prayers into our sleeves. "Commander," the astropath said, his voice a rasp that trembled in the air like a broken reed. "There is some interference. Not normal. Not like a storm. It is a fold. The navigator's sense is blocked. I can reach, but only with half the choir." He folded his hands as if that could keep the noise inside him tidy. He used terms like fold and choir without offering the safety of explanation. Those were enough. We had charts of past folds, maps of where sight had gone poor and ships had listed and never righted themselves. Each of those histories sat in my mouth like a sour seed. The bridge made a small shared calculation. We could hold and pray the navigator came back. We could attempt a correction using the helm's backup logic and the astropath's partial transcriptions as a guide. Both options carried tolls. Holding might mean drifting into a place where the warp sharpened like a blade. Correcting might mean steering with a blind cup of light and hoping the hole in our sight did not swallow us. The ship was a ledger that required a signature. My hands felt like someone else's. I thought of the crew, dozens, maybe hundreds, depending on the manifest folded into the belly of the hull. Faces came to me like shutters that opened, some I knew by voice, some by standing in the wrong place and taking a true stern look. I thought of the navigator, a creature in its chamber who had never pretended to be human, who had its own contracts and hungers, and likely would not have wanted to be saved. Yet its silence made my decisions thin and fragile. I thought of the astropath, who had given half a translation, and then looked as if the act had cost him something he could not account for. I thought of nothing else because choice does not allow for fancy. "Options," I said. I did not try to gild the word. The chart lay open like a wound. "Helm suggests a slow arc to safer vector," I told them. "It will keep us under active dampers longer." My voice kept the numbers clipped because numbers are shapes you can hold. The helmsman nodded, his jaw working. The comms officer waited with a hand on the astropathic relay as though afraid to press it. "Or," I added, and the word came like a counterweight. "We attempt an emergency link. We try to find the blind spot in the navigator's perception and thread a corrective through it. It is risky. It will use the choir's strength and the ship's reserves." I watched the crew as if turning a face to gauge a breeze. Their faces were little islands of attention. Two voices, quiet, precise, asked the same thing without speaking. Will you risk us for a chance at sight, or will you let us drift and hope? The emergency link was not a miracle. It was a surgical reach into a dark room in the brain of the Navigator. It would bind ship systems to a thin, sanctioned thread of psychic feedback and attempt to map what the Navigator could no longer show. It required drawing on reserve power, opening conduits we otherwise kept closed. It demanded a violent intimacy with the thing we had never seen, the blind spot. Anyone who had read old ship logs knew how these attempts had ended badly, sometimes in the ship systems being burned, and sometimes in the ship's crew hearing things they could not unhear. The astropath's choir would be strained, perhaps injured. The ship would heave like an animal at the leash. But without that attempt, we had no course. Link, I said. Saying it made it more than a thought. The word carried an edge now. The helmsman looked up, his eyes dark and sudden. The comms officer began the chant of codes, and the steward slid a manual clamp across a console as if making the ship a body to be tended. The astropath closed his eyes and mouthed fragment prayers, whatever real priesthoods he owed, and the bridge hummed with the sound of people making a decision they prayed would not be the last. I did not sleep in the hours before a choice. You do not sleep when you are preparing a link. You check seals, you verify tolerances, you calculate the cost and set an order in cold metal, and pray the calculation is kinder than mercy. I watched the sequence spool and felt each node light like a tiny sternum. The emergency circuits came online with a sound that was all wires and nerves. The artificial dampers clicked in their housings, a small siren of mechanical relief. The hollows split into new readouts, clean lines that suggested a plan. The blind spot on the map glowed, not with information, but with the promise of something to be sought. Link open on my mark, I said. My voice did not press down on the fear. It rubbed against it, like fingers on cloth. The astropath's breathing changed. He was a man bracing for the cold. The helmsman whispered a sequence of old data as if invoking saints. The comms officer keyed the override with a hand that did not look like it belonged to anyone who had the right to touch sacred things. The bridge tightened as if it were a hand around a throat. I gave the order. The emergency link began to unfurl. A thin electric thread crawled across my console, a blue seam that tasted like fear and copper. The ship answered in a way it had not before. A pulse, small and clarifying, that chased the blind architecture of the map. It was the first forward motion we had taken since the silence. For a breath, my chest unpinned, and I allowed the notion that we might be steering again. The astropath cried out, but whether it was pain or prayer I could not say. The navigator's chamber, a blind aperture on the display, shifted imperceptibly, as if noticing the touch. We had bridged nothing yet. We had only begun. But the emergency link was a path, and paths ask you to walk them. I watched the conduit flare, and then narrow, waiting for the navigator's inner geometry to meet our reach, waiting for the voice that had been swallowed to answer, or for the silence to reply with teeth. The hum thinned to a thread until it vanished beneath rubbing boots and the hiss of cooling plates. The Geller field still held, barely, but the familiar chorus that had guided me since my first crossing was gone. Where a navigator's sight should have laid a pale map across the ship's instruments, there was a seam of black on the astropathic logs. The astropath's voice returned, but it was wrong. It slurred like a choir that had been unstitched and stitched back the wrong way, words cut and spliced in a patchwork that hurt to listen to. On the log, the cut was a blank timecode and a jagged annotation, blind seam. The scribes who patched the relay used neat, clinical strokes. In the engine room, the boilermen used a different language. They said the warp had teeth. We moved through those teeth as if through a hunting animal. The blind seam slid along our vectors like a predator scenting breath. Every correction made it twist, and every hesitation let it close. The helmsman looked like a man who had been asked to stop the heartbeat of a child without anesthetic. His hands were steady, but his face was wrong, pale in a way that made bone show through. I could taste copper. The options down the chain were small and formal. Blind jump, force the fold without sight, pray that blind faith and calculation proved truer than intuition. Weeks-long drift, play a slow, careful game of avoidance until the seam passed, burning stores and patience. Improvise human steering. Teach people with terrestrial sight to imagine the warp through instruments, and we'll thread a ship without a navigator by hand. Protocol was a physical thing, like a suit of armor you put on, because you believed it would keep you whole. It had been hammered into us in port and on the vector decks at every posting. You did not improvise across a seam. You did not substitute flesh for bloodline. The Imperium did not like improvisation. It liked rules sharp and clean. I broke one anyway. There was a sound when I did it. Not a shout or a bark, it was a soft click, like a latch releasing. I sanctioned the workshop that night, a room that smelled of oil and hot metal, and the faint, sweet tang of old incense burned in a makeshift chapel where the crew prayed for mercy. We pulled the charts and the astropathic loop. We dragged out what the Navigator left behind: a broken throne rigging, a fractured sight lens, a hand-scrawled note that said nothing at all. They looked at me with those small fears that a command can bring. The astropath, his eye-ringed face still jittering with the aftershocks, kept saying, "It is not absence, it is interference." His words creaked like old doors. He had been the one who signed off on the notation of the seam. He had heard the cut in his mind and knew how a silence could gnaw through thought. He rubbed his hands as if to remove static. "We will not make a jump blind," I said. "We will not drift until our stores taste of grain and rot. We will steer. We will not be a ship without course. There's a particular way authority changes a room. You could see it in the helmsman's shoulders, in the boilerman's stooped back. They had obeyed nav codes for longer than I had held rank. But obedience was brittle survival, made it flexible. Human steering is not noble. It is an act of violence against the natural order of spacefaring. A navigator can feel the warp like heat, like the press of a hand across the skull. We do not have that. I could not see the seam. I could only see what it did to things that could sense it. The astropath's voice would be my compass, distorted and scarred, but better than nothing. We turned the workshops into a makeshift bridge and stripped the ocular plates from the navigator's rig, not to rebuild the site, but to learn its language. The lens array coughed when we powered it. It gave off a smell of burnt ceramic and the sour tang of old ether. The engineers rigged a feedback net of servos and gauge readers. They fed the astropath's warped chorus into a lattice of crude filters, hoping to harvest pattern from the noise. "Listen," I told them. "Listen for the cut. If a navigator is a lighthouse, the astropath is the keeper who shouts numbers across a gale. We would be both keepers and lighthouse now, and that was obscene and quieting." The astropath closed his eyes and let the signal come. His throat made a sound that could have been a prayer or a seizure. I watched his jaw work as if something on the inside were naming the darkness. We trained the helmsman to translate tone into vector shift. A sharp drop in pitch meant pull starboard, a ringing chord meant increase pitch. The astropath coughed the warp like an instrument. When the cut bloomed, it made a broken note that slit through the lattice. The servo stuttered and spat warnings. Spreadsheets of angles and inertial dampening flashed across panels. The helmsman chewed his lip and moved a lever by feel. It was clumsy. It was slower than a navigator's thought. It was terrifying in ways I had not imagined. The The first time we made a correction based on the astropath's warped whisper, the ship shuddered like a beast waking. Food trays slid off their clamps. A lathe in the engineering deck skipped a beat and then started again, as if embarrassed. There was a rhythm to it, sudden and animal, like trying to ride a thing that has its own mind. Sometimes the seam would bite, and we would be forced to yank course, and the ship would groan, and the astropath would make a sound like he had swallowed a nail. Other times the seam would drift past us and leave us with a silence that felt heavier than the first noise. Each time it passed, we paid in heat and tedium and cursing. The crew learned to move with me. They learned to trust the astropath's broken song. Trust changes people. It makes a helmsman stop asking for permission and start asking God for forgiveness. It makes an engineer lay his palm on a cold hull and murmur numbers as if they were psalms. It makes the astropath cough out a directive that had no proper syntax and watch me nod as if he'd spoken in complete sentences. I grew used to the bipartite presence, the mechanical and the human, combining into an ugly, useful language. We did not only rely on the astropath. I kept my eyes on the visible stars. We aligned dead, reckoning, telescopic bearings, the slow burn of micro-jump thrusters that traced tiny arcs like careful stitches. The Navigator had prepared charts that might have been decoration in another life, but now they were maps to pockets of less risk. We stitched them together with the astropath's cadence until something like a path emerged. There were small betrayals of the warp we had not foreseen. The seam didn't simply pass along an axis. It hunted. It reacted to corrections the way a sun reacts to a planet. When we pushed, it pulled. When we lingered, it loomed. We discovered too late that the blind seam could migrate into the ship's own psychic residuals. Noise from the engine room, a child's laugh on the Vox, a memory of a dead canticle playing in the chapel. These things could become needles in the seam's mouth, drawing it like iron to a horseshoe. I found myself guarding not only instruments, but silence. I ordered the chapel doors closed and the choir to mute their hymns. I silenced the lower wards and told the crew to keep the mess quiet. No laughter, no shouts, no music. You would think that would be easy in a place built of steel and noise. It wasn't. Silence sits like a beast in the chest. People whispered prayers into their sleeves. The astropath warned me once in a series of syllables that made the men around him step backward. Contagion, he said at last, the word thin and brittle. The seam spreads not only by movement, it spreads by attention. You look, it looks back. He had always spoken in riddles. He had never put a human cost at the edge of a phrase before. What then? I asked. The engines purred underfoot, waiting like a patient beast. How do we stop it? We do not stop it, he said. We starve it. Starve it of what? I thought. Sight, of course. The Navigator's eye was gone. But the seam ate more than sight. It ate meaning. The astropath meant we must make ourselves unappetizing. Deny it emotion, deny it pattern, deny it anything that would let it find purchase. That was a tall order on a ship. Humans do not easily eat silence, so we turned the ship into a machine that pretended to be empty. We recycled the crew's sleep cycles. We automated the mess into cold rations. We reduced the number of voices. We sent men with the reputation of being hard to move into the observation decks to watch for anomalies and instructed them to keep their faces expressionless, as if a poker face could fool the warp. The astropath taught them to hum at a frequency that interfered with the seam's appetite, a low monotone that felt like someone tightening a strap around your ribs. The seam reacted. It tried to squeeze through the humming, to ride the frequency like a worm on a string. It shifted course, looking for softer flesh. Each time it did, we adjusted, trading a margin of fuel for a margin of safety. The ship began to smell less of oil and more of iron and linen. The crew worked like sleepwalking saints. Night after night, I lay awake on the deck with my palms pressed to the cold metal, and I imagined the Navigator's sight as a lantern extinguished by wind. I thought of the line of men who had specific birthrights, of eyes that had woven mariners out of warp foam for centuries, and I felt a hot, guilty respect for those privileges they carried. They were absent now. Their absence was a tool in the seam's talons. We could have waited for the seam to pass. It would have been surgical cowardice. We could have thrown dice at the warp and made a blind jump. That gamble had cost lives on other ships. The comfort of protocol would have saved our names, but not our people. I had chosen human steering because it gave us agency in a place that had been carved into inevitability. Preparation became ritual. We wired the helmsman's console to the astropath's diaphragmatic pulses. We rigged manual override wheels behind plates of reinforced brass, so a human hand could feel the tug on the vector, not merely see it. We harnessed inertial dampeners to damp the shudder when the seam bit. We practiced corrective arcs until our hands remembered them like prayer. We painted on the faces of the watchers a neutrality that slowly made them look dead. At dawn after the third night, if dawn could be said to exist in a place that spun in a vacuum, the astropath's voice sharpened. It was the clearest thing I had heard from him in days. The cut moved. It moved as predators move before an ambush, in a long, almost human intelligence. It had decided to test us. "Ready," I said. The helmsman nodded. His eyelids trembled. His hands found the wheels without looking, as if muscle had learned what the mind could not. The astropath inhaled. He fed the lattice a crooked cadence, and the servos answered in sympathetic ticks. The engines hummed. The seam was close enough that I could feel the ship lean toward it, like a horse falling into a ridden path. We had a plan that would have made a navigator laugh, if a navigator were present to do so. It had been drawn by men who had never been gifted with the sight, but were stubborn enough to map consequence. It was crude, small burns to feather the seam, a sequence of micro-corrections, a timing of the crew's hum to confuse the seam's predatory calculus. It relied on discipline, on men who would become instruments rather than voices. My hand hovered over the manual release. Around me, the bridge smelled of sweat and oil, and the faint antiseptic of the astropath's breaths. The seam shifted again, and I could not tell if it was drawn to us or repelled. The ship creaked. A bolt popped in some distant compartment, a tiny exclamation point. I pressed the release. The craft answered with a shudder that felt like the beginning of a fall. The clock sloped. The astropath sang through his teeth. The helmsman moved. The servos hummed a tired hymn. We were not yet through, but we were moving into the seam on purpose, not by accident. Everything felt smaller and closer at once. The thrum of the engines, the astropath's whisper, the breath of the crew. We had chosen the last, most dangerous option and turned it into a procedure. Whether that procedure would save us, maim us, or simply teach us a new superstition was not yet known. All I could feel was the motion we had made together, the deliberate step into an uncertain dark. I signed the sanction with hands that did not feel like mine. The pen, an old bone stylus stolen from some dead chapel on a dead world, clattered against the slate as if struck by small teeth. Around me, the bridge smelled of ozone and cold iron, the way a throat smells before it learns a new song. The navigator lay silent beneath a net of glass and metal, eyes open and empty like the dead eye of a clock. His mind, the thing that had held the warp at bay for 10,000 miles, had gone mute. We had drifted. Time had thinned. When the Psyker-link was proposed, the word itself hung in the air, like a prayer spoken in the wrong tongue. The senior astropath sent back stuttering fragments. messages that tasted like ash on the tongue when I listened in the dark, and the crew began to see the edges of things that were not there at all. A man swore he watched the corridor spill into itself like a mouth. The cook swore breakfast had looked back at her. Small lights along the hull bled into the Geller hum, then vanished, leaving pale fingerprints of illumination against the skin of the ship. Morale cracked like thin ice. I knew the cost. All of us did. A sanctioned psyker was not a ship's compass. He was a human hand forced to cup the shape of the warp and hold it steady long enough for the engines to find purchase. He would steer, and in returning the favor, the warp would take something back. It had taken lovers, names, quiet parts of nights. It took pieces of the soul like a bartender pocketing coins for a tab you never asked to open. Still, the choice was between a price and an oblivion none of us could afford. Brother Malin volunteered with the kind of small, fierce smile that had always frightened me. He walked like a man who had memorized every corridor of a cathedral and intended to file his bones there after his prayers. Malin had been a hospital attendant 3 years ago, thin, quick hands, an awful laugh, and something in the medici had found him useful and dangerous at the same time. His eyes were not the same as other men's. They held a squint of distance, as if a wind from elsewhere constantly pressed against his lids. "Tell me what you will take," I asked him, "because language can sometimes trade for courage." He looked at his hands, the veins in the backs of them like map threads. "I don't know," he said. "Only that it will want, that it will name its hunger loud and soft. I will do it for the crew." He paused. "If it asks for a name, give it mine." We sealed the ritual in the old way the Navtech calls linking, and the chapel calls binding. The helmsman shaved a circle of ash from a candle kept for impossible nights, and drew sigils in the air with his fingertip. The psyker was led to the nav recess, where the navigator would have sat if his eyes had not been reeds full of nothing. We strapped Malin into the harness that tasted of machine oil and prayer. It was a crude throne, an upright cage of coils and glass that hummed faintly when touched. The first touch of the link on Malin was small, like an insect sigh. He took 3 breaths and then stopped counting them for us. Through the weave of the ship, the Geller field shivered. A patch of the deck lamps went out and then flared blue, as though a cold star had been cupped in the palm of the atmosphere. The hum of the field, long and even, grew ragged as if someone were playing an ancient instrument with elbows. "You might hear me," Malin said, voice thin. He spoke to no one in particular. "Or you might not. If you cannot, it's better to tell me so I can make room for what the warp wants to offer." Around us, the crew began to say things. Quietly at first. "Did you see that?" And then in bursts. The navigator's attendant, a little woman named Harl, who kept her hair in a strict knot, swore she saw the engine room crawl with hands the size of doors. The engineer spat and said nothing. The astropath, chained in the communication ward to keep his messages honest, sang scraps of the Emperor's litany in the wrong order, half prayers and half translations that came out like gravel. Malin's eyes shifted. He looked not at any physical thing in the nav recess, but through it, beyond it, as if his gaze had become a far-sighted lens. Then his mouth moved. His first words were not words. They were noise that sank into the hull like ice water. Low, a shivering chorus of consonants and breath. The coil sensors picked up fluctuations in the Geller field that the nav computer translated into erratic course vectors, impossible tremors no machine should have felt. I placed my palm on the console because it was the only human thing left that could steady my hands. The metal was cold. Under it, the ship thrummed in sympathy with Malin sounds. For a moment, the coils shuddered, and the nav lamps painted the bridge with an inside-out dusk. Then Malin spoke a name, not his own, and the ship seemed to sigh. The cost, when it began, didn't come as gall or pain. It began as absence. Marlin's laugh, a thing that used to rattle the ward with ridiculousness, left his mouth like a photograph. He blinked, and the rare joke he kept in his throat had slipped from him, like a coin falling through a grate. He frowned and pointed at nothing. "It asks for a thing that sits behind doors," he muttered. "Something I carried. It says it wants small company." "Don't let it," Harold said, her voice thin. "Don't give it memory." She spoke with a clarity that astonished me. She was bone-tired, her eyes had lost their shine. But when the warp sharpened, so did certain people's fears. I watched Marlin yield. He opened his mouth and offered name after name. Little things first, songs he knew as a child, a scar on his knee, the flavor of soup he had not tasted since he was 12. Each time he named something, the air around him thinned. It was like watching a candle blow itself out in stages. He smiled when he gave them away, as if handing out bread at a blockade. The crew called it bravery. I called it sacrificial accounting. The astropath's transmissions came back in shorter fragments. Where before a message might have been a clear chain of thought stitched across light years, now it arrived like a broken string of beads, cut through and acid bright. The content slid from the ward into our heads as impressions more than text. Star, wrong, watch, ashes. The words burdened the throat with salt, and I had to stop myself from tasting those fragments like a man who scoops salt from an open wound. For all the damage, the ship began to move. The engines found a trembling rhythm. Vector corrections flowed through the nav computer in hesitant edits. The hull experienced the first small changes, of course, like a body caught and set back on its feet after a stumble. We were not yet sailing true, but we were no longer suspended in the thin hour between stars. That small victory came at a price. Mullane's pupils seemed to hold moving shadows. Sometimes when he closed his eyes, he smiled, and in that smile a different voice echoed, not quite his, the way coral remembers the shape of tide. Crew members who had looked upon him afterward said they felt warmth drain out of the air, as if the man were warming the ship with his bare hands and leaving the heat behind him. At night, the hallucinations grew bolder. Not all of them were menacing. One of the young deckhands claimed the walls whispered the names of his dead cousins in a circle, like a lullaby. Another swore the corridor to the med bay opened into a field of low grass under 2 moons. Some of these visions were like small kindnesses, odd consolations offered by a place that otherwise gnawed at sanity. Others were knives pressed gently at the throat. The line between glimpse and threat thinned and sometimes braided into one. We kept a watch on Malin. The harness marked him in places with thin bruises. The map of a night watched hard. He slept with his fingers clenched, and when awake he sometimes held his hands up as if cupping a tiny fleeing thing. When he laughed, when the warp allowed him laughter, the sound tasted metallic, as if memory itself had been sharpened by a file. The men who heard it left the ward quieter. They touched their temples as if the laugh had rearranged something delicate inside. At one point, the Navigator twitched, a cruel little movement of a finger like a marionette, noting that its strings were being used elsewhere. Harold took it and screamed, a sound that broke some of the thin things inside the bridge. There are screams that are small and private. Harold's was wide as a bell. She said the Navigator had said, "Come," in a voice that was not his, and that it felt like being invited into a house that had no roof. The ship's morale bled into logistics. Rations were eaten more slowly. Work shifts rotated with hands that shook. The engineer stopped in the middle of repairing a coolant line and looked at the starboard viewport. He told me he could see a figure standing in the glare of a distant sun, not quite in the right perspective. He said, I think it's watching us because we're going where it wants. He was not the sort to get poetic. His hands left oil on the console like confessions. Melane's handkerchief, which once carried the scent of incense, began to smell faintly of salt and old paper. He began to lose days. He would not know what day it was, or which face in his memory belonged to a man named Aller, who fixed boots for free. He called out to people who did not answer, because they did not exist in his present. When I asked him once what he had lost, he gave me a pocketful of details, small, beautiful things, names and tastes, and smiled like a man at an altar. "This is the price we were told about," I said once in the quiet after watch change, to no one and everyone. "Remember the litany, give of yourself and steer the rest." "You're sanctifying it," the engineer said. He had grease on his cheek and a child's drawing folded in his breast. "We are not saints, Captain. We are desperate." His voice was not unkind, it was factual. Desperation is a currency no one respects until it's the only medium left. I authorized more. The nav computer adjusted, small increments, patched by human sense rather than machine certainty. The ship changed course toward a gravity well the autoplot had repeatedly rejected. It was a path less likely to be smooth, but it had the granularity a live mind could read. We moved, and as we moved, the ship gave back to the warp. Not all offerings showed as absence. Sometimes it took joy in strange ways. Once, for 3 minutes that felt like an hour and an age, the corridor to the mess filled with the scent of rain on tar. Men stood and wept at the smell. An old deckhand laughed in the corner and said, "For a second I was a man with a bay of fish again." That small mercy did not cancel the losses, it salted them. At the end of my watch, as the nav lamps pooled tired gold across the console, Malin reached for his own throat. He had been giving the warp pieces like a man stripping wallpaper to find a window. Now he grasped for the thing it had promised most. He looked at me with a steadier gaze than he had carried all night. "If it asks for a name, it wants more than a word," he said. "It takes things that anchor you. It will set us moving, but we must be ready when the world wants its toll." I had the choice in that moment to withdraw the sanction. I had the authority to end the ritual and watch the ship falter, our course unravel into the thin hours between stars. But I had also felt the small, impossible correction under my palm when Malin first took the link. The way the hull obeyed a human voice, like someone answering a parent's call. I gave the order to hold the link. My voice sounded thin and half-ceremonial, like someone pronouncing a vow under distant thunder. Around me, the bridge kept breathing with the ship. The coils hummed. The nav lamps made the world a little paler. Malin closed his eyes, and the air around him shivered in sympathy. We were moving now, but not toward safety yet. We were moving toward a point in space that required us to step blind and faithful. The psyker drew deeper into the weave, and I felt the ship answer him, like an animal recognizing the scent of rain. Something in the Geller field thrummed with a new appetite. It had accepted the currency. It had tasted the first coin. I could see the course on the holosphere, a faint line drawn through a region the charts called stupid and unkind. The helmsman leaned forward and said, "If this fails, we lose more than a course." He didn't need to finish. No one in that room could have finished it. Malin's lips moved again, quieter this time, as if singing a prayer into a dark pocket. He began to name things the warp had never asked before. The color of his sister's eyes, a boy's name from a street market, the pattern on an old coat. The ship answered with the subtle pull of engines, the small correction that meant momentum and hope. I sat back and watched the first true motion of our journey in days. We were no longer drifting. We were leaning into a set of stars and toward a place that might save us, and might not. The psyker link held, taut and dangerously bright. and as the hull sighed and the nav computer recalculated, I realized the next decision would not be mine alone. The warp had accepted payment. It would come again for the remainder. We had chosen to pay the toll, but not yet agreed which of us would make the next offering. I tightened my grip on the console and let the ship carry us into that uncharted correction, feeling its tendency to ask for more, like a hunger at the edge of hearing. The helm set the new vector. The route unfurled like a night road I had never wanted to take. Ahead lay a course that had teeth. I commanded the crew to prepare for whatever its bite might be. The Psyker's whisper braided with the Geller hum, and for the first time since the Navigator fell mute, there was motion in the ship that felt like intention. The hum cut like a held breath. For a moment it was everything, the slow, consequentiaric vibration that told us we were still whole. Then it thinned, and the ship felt suddenly like an animal that had stopped to listen and could hear nothing at all. The warded corridors lost their small, reassuring rattle. The lamps above the navigation deck winked like tired eyes. In the link, where the Psyker and the Navigator meet the ship's bones, there was not emptiness, but an intention. A shape pretending to be a gap. The first impression was a pulling, subtle and hungry. It tugged at the edges of the link, at the place where the Navigator's blindness ought to lie, an absence that should have been neutral, a dark corridor for our passage. Instead, the void shoved back, becoming something with memory and teeth. The Psyker felt it long before we could see it. I watched their shoulders tense under the telemetry of the ship, like a man feeling for a rope in the dark. Their breath hitched in time with the machinery. They threaded their presence through the howl of the immaterium, like a seamstress threading a needle through razor glass. You cannot explain this to men who have never tasted the warp's throat. The immaterium is not only noise, but color and pressure, a sky that pinches the lungs. In the link, it was a scream smoothed into a constant keening. The Psyker spoke to it in a language older than speech, and that sound was a small, terrible light in the web. When their words found the Navigator's null, the web answered. It was a snare. Something had taken refuge inside the Navigator's fall, using that sanctioned nothing as a hook to drag us into a place that is not a place. We saw it in the telemetry as a corruption of angle and intent. The ship's course jittered like a heartbeat gone arrhythmic. Instruments reported small shifts that suggested 1,000 impossible microfalls. Aboard, practical men tightened harnesses and muttered prayers they could not hear themselves say. The Navigator, still silent, sat with his hands folded and his face gone hard as if he were trying not to give away what he felt. The risk was not abstract. If that snare was allowed to fasten, the Geller field would fray where it touched the void, and fraying here means the ship would see what the warp wished us to see, and then try to make us into that thing. The question came down to a wordless calculus. We could cut the link, jettison the Navigator's chamber, break the psychic leash, and try to steer blind. That would be a gamble of a familiar kind, made with hands on sticks and eyes on the stars. Or we could hold the link and attempt a binding, an act of sympathetic cost. The latter required the Psyker to offer a part of themselves, not blood, but something like a memory stitch, a thread of identity knotted into the ship's wards to act as ballast. It was an irreversible theft. Once given, it would corrode the giver's inner scaffolding. They would keep functioning. They would still be there. But the contour of them would change, their private geography eaten away, piece by piece. I watched the Psyker when I made my decision. People imagine that those who bind the warp are monstrous or saintly by nature. They're neither. The Psyker was young in a way the shipbed's lines and time could not display. Their jaw clenched and unclenched like someone testing new muscles. Their eyes flicked to me for less than a breath, and in that look there was a ledger, an inventory of what could be spent. I signed the order. My hand made the mark that lets a life be paid for many others, and the ink was heavier than I had expected. The ritual began in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony, as councilmen understand it. There were no candles, no chanting of the old sects. The psyker sat, palms pressed to the frayed metal of the deck, and let the link pull at their mind. They reached inward and unspooled, slow, deliberate, like a man giving away the lining of his coat to someone shivering. The first thing they lost was a detail, the smell of rain on a street they would never return to. It left like a faint scent evaporating under heat. Then came an image of a child's laugh, and then the shape of a name. I watched the light in their eyes dim in slices. You could see the bargain being made in small, human ways. Their fingers trembled where they touched the deck. A single tear rolled, because their eyes no longer remembered why tears were for. The link around them flared with colors, even the psychics called by name, but that we see only as moods: sour violet, the flat green of old coin, a deep, slow black like tar. The ship answered too. The hum regained a thread of tone, a connective frequency that meant the wards were knitting. Instruments steadied. The jitter in our course calmed from frantic to purposeful. For a moment, you could believe the danger had been banished, but the price is not paid in a single coin. The ritual took, then asked for more. The psyker's mouth-shaped words that no human throat had ever used, syllables like removing teeth from a jaw. With each sound, the ship seemed to lean on them a little harder, trusting their flesh as a substitute for the navigator's blind corridor. They began to cough, soft, a dry rattle that suggested internal sand. The cough was not wholly physical. It was memory regurgitated in a different register. A crewman near the deck reported, voice going small, that he could taste salt where there had been none. The bridge smelled for a time of sea spray and paper money and the iron tang of blood that had never been shed. I remembered promises made in my own youth about duty and choice. The ritual's effect was immediate for some and slow for others. For the ship, it was immediate. The snares pull eased, as if the thing on the other end had lost purchase and was being forced to show itself. In the link, the psyker's presence tightened into a cord of white fire and then thinned, like a rope being burned away strand by strand. The navigator, still mute, pressed his forehead into his hands and for the first time moved. He reached out with a small, hesitant finger and brushed the psyker's shoulder. The touch was not a rescue. It was acknowledgement. A pact made in the soundless space between breaths. I could not help watching for how the sacrifice would change the psyker. The first change you notice is always small, an absence where a memory should have been. The second is a redirection of attention. Things that had mattered to them before now skittered past like fish in murky water. They forgot names mid-sentence, and then whole afternoons. Their smile, which had been given freely and easily, now took effort, like an actor remembering a practiced expression. There is a cruelty to watching someone you have ordered to save. You grow less themselves. You see the edges of what made them particular start to blur, and you know that blurring is permanent. The crew reacted predictably, and not. There were curses and prayers in equal measure. The ship's surgeon spoke to me as if bargaining with a machine rather than a human soul, measuring odds and recovery rates. A pair of junior officers stood with their hands at their sides, neither giving nor asking. Behind them, the engine crews kept at their stations with the stubborn, sacred detachment of men accustomed to death in the margins. They are the backbone of a starship, people who will prepare a spanner while someone else dies in ritual. I felt their stares like a chorus of small, pointed knives. Time in that moment elongated. The hum held us like a good hand. The snare had not been fully severed, rather it had been distracted, pinned under the weight of a living thing who could hold both sides at once. The psyker's face took on a thinness, as if someone had pressed a hand to their cheeks and drawn the life inward. They spoke less, and when they did, their words were fragments. Sometimes they mouthed a name that none of us recognized. Sometimes they described a color that made the Navigator flinch. Sometimes they simply whispered, "Steady," and our hull replied by tightening every bolt. I found my thoughts wandering, as the one who had signed the order always does. There is a private ledger that opens when you make such decisions. You count not only the cost now, but the costs that accumulate later, how the psyker will be less capable of future bindings, how they will forget names they swore to remember, how they will one day look at their own hands and not recognize the work done upon them. There are no clean exits from this kind of debt, only continued motion. We were not going to anchor in memory. We were going forward, deeper into the route the Navigator had begun before he fell silent. As the ritual reached a nodding point, the link shivered and threw up a sound that none of our instruments could place. It was neither the scream we had been fighting nor the hum that kept us together. It was more like a note you hear when a bell has been struck in a distant, sealed cathedral. The ship answered with a change in gravitational micropressures, a polite but decisive shove that reminded every hand on deck that we were in a three-dimensional ocean and not a museum. The Navigator's eyes opened then, and they were not the blank, cold pools of before. They had focus. He looked straight at me with a look that was not pleading, but not at peace either. He had not been saved. He had been used, as we all had, as a hinge on which a decision swung. I gave the order to set a new bearing. We would take the course that the psyker had threaded for us, through narrow passages, weaving between clusters of dead stars and the places where the warp lodges its teeth. The crew moved with practiced obedience, but the ritual's aftersmoke clung to them like lint. The psyker straightened, visibly diminished, and yet still standing. They met my eyes for a fraction of a heartbeat and nodded. There was no gratitude or triumph in that nod. It was a statement of capacity. They had performed their ledger's duty and now waited for the inevitable corrosion to begin. We slid back into the dark with the regularity of a creature that knows both danger and necessity. The snare had been unhooked from our immediate path, but there was a new thing in the link now, something quieter, patient, and aware that payment had been made. It watched us like a creditor watching a man who has emptied his purse on the table. I felt the ship's hull drink in the stars, felt our trajectory knit itself along the new line. The psyker's hand rested near the instrument console, tremor steadying. They had bought us sight, and in return, a piece of them would corrode away with time. I kept my face set and my decisions clear, because the next choice would come faster than any of us wished. We moved forward because that is what we do. The bridge hummed with the noise of living things, making a route through the dark. Outside, the void pressed against the hull like a thought leaning on a skull. Inside, the link pulsed with the faint, persistent beat of someone who had given too much and everything else that clung to them. I already felt the weight of the next decision, how to use this borrowed sight, who to trust with it, and how to shield the psyker from a second demand that might take them entirely. The course lay open, a thin slit of light between stars, and we were heading straight into it. The Geller hum went first. It didn't die with a bang or a crack, it thinned the way light does through smoke. 1 second the ship breathed that constant, warm vibration that held back the teeth of the immaterium, and the next it leaned away from us like a tired animal. We felt the absence as a pressure in our bones. The lights took on the color of old metal. The corridor felt too long. The lane opened like a seam in cloth. It was no spectacle, no boiling, screaming rift, just a narrow, pale throat between realities, the kind the Navigator liked to call a lane, because it made the thing sound tidy. The bridge split into a long, steady intake of relief and terror. The helmsman swore under his breath. My hands tightened on the console. The ship's staggered instruments hiccuped and then sorted themselves into the familiar lies of charted space. Stars returned, thin and honest. We were home on the far side of something that had wanted to keep us. Not everyone came back the same. If the Navigator was alive at all, he was not the same creature that had folded the lane out of those impossible geometries. His eyes had the faraway wash of tide marks, eyes that still tracked the weave of warp size, but no longer reached for the lives tethered to him. Where once he had muttered coordinates and taste shapes that made our courses safe, now he was small and mute, turning his head like a thing that had learned to listen for a music it could no longer hear. His hands trembled with the memory of thread he could not touch. We had forced him through by a bargain that was neither holy nor clean. The bargain sat on the deck like a thing we could not scrub away. The ship's psyker had given, or had been given, depending on which lie you preferred, something living from himself into the breach. There are words for what that looked like: a memory, a sense, a shard of sentience. We said a living piece, because that is what it felt like, not corpse, but a missing warmth, an absence you could feel at the base of your skull. When it left him, the psyker's gaze narrowed, as if someone had shuttered a bright window. He did not speak much afterwards. He smiled sometimes, and it did not reach him. The math of our survival was exact. Warplanes can be forced open by power, by machines pressed to their limits, by prayer muttered until they become curses. But there was a ledger stamped in softer ink. Something had to pay. We chose the only currency we had at hand. We paid in a living thing's capacity to see, and we paid in the slow erosion of a man who no longer owned all of himself. We made port with most of our bodies intact, which is a mercy the sector does not hand out easily. There were inspections and hands that looked through us with clinical curiosity, ailing pleasantries from officials who smelled of ozone and cheap mint. They stamped papers, they counted cargo, they pronounced us fit for travel with the mechanical indifference of clerks who have never tasted the warp. We did not try to explain. We dressed our wounds, and we joked in corners where no one asked too many questions. Jokes, when the truth is too sharp, become bandages. The Navigator sat in the engine 4 with his palms on the maptable, tracing star lines he no longer felt. The crew kept a courteous distance. We ate in silence sometimes, the clatter of utensils loud as thunder. The psyker would stand at the rail and watch the void as if it were a wound he expected to see seared closed. Sometimes when the warded lights dimmed and the hum settled to its usual note, I would find him on the deck, fingers pressed to the hull, listening for a sound that had gone missing. He would look up when I came near, and there would be that tremor in his mouth as if he might apologize for being smaller than he had been. Command tastes different after you take that measure. Decision feels hollow because you know the hollow was carved by hand. Orders that once fell from me like weights now all carried a ghost value. Men followed, they always do. But they followed with the memory of what we had bartered. Their obedience was a ledger of its own. I could not pretend it was not there when a lieutenant hesitated at a door or when the engineer lingered too long over a fuse. Every action felt scored against that secret. You cannot eat without tasting ash after you have burned a soul for light. There are laws about psychics and bargains and what a ship may summon and what it may take. There are tribunals that would have called our names and opened us like crates if they'd known the exact nature of the work we had done. We did not tell them. We kept our ledger to our chests and folded it under other papers and told no one outside the small rooms where the truth hung between us in the stale air. Silence becomes a kind of armor. It is also a rotting thing inside your mouth. At night, the crew slept with their boots still on. Dreams were thin and crowded with the smell of ozone and the echo of displaced voices. Someone would shift in their bunk, and the whole compartment would twitch, as if the ship itself remembered the cost. Children in the lower decks, children we had not had the right to bring on this voyage, but had kept because an orphanage in the last port had looked at us with too many mouths to feed, would press their foreheads to the map glass and point at stars as if the world were still a story they could bind. Their innocence was its own indictment. We argued once, sharp and brief, about what to do with the Navigator. The rashness of the moment made us almost betray our secret to each other. One of the quartermasters, a blunt man who had smelled too many corridors for secrets to sit well, said we should offload him, find some hospice or cult that would take the broken thing. He said the ship needed clean machinery. The psyker put his palm on the quartermaster's jaw like a benediction and told him to sit down. "Not yet," he said, and the silence that followed was not peace, but calculation. We did not speak of our real intention, though we all knew it. We could not hand him to strangers. We could not let the ledger be called in by people who would count more than we could bear. So we kept going. You keep going, because the universe is not patient, and because ports cost money, and because there is a small, selfish piece of you that clings to the notion of finishing what you started. The Navigator learned to hide his hands in his sleeves. He learned to mimic the cadence of a man who had not been plucked. He would occasionally look up and give me a look that said, "I tried, and I could not." Those moments were the ones that cut the deepest. People think survival is a simple pulse chart: breath, fuel, hull pressure. They forget the ledger that underwrites choices. You survive, in the end, because you have been willing to accept what will not be undone. The burn marks of that decision do not heal. They flare if you press them. They leave a taste on your tongue that does not wash out. That was the lesson we carried into guild halls and supper rooms, through the corridors of dockside bodegas, and into the quiet hours before shifting course again. We slept with one eye open, not because of heretics hiding in the shadows, but because of what we had already done. Yet even as the guilt settled on my shoulders like armor, the same way a coat does in winter, there was a different feeling creeping up behind it, a thin, electric hunger. Not for more power, not for more bargains, but for restitution of a kind we could not buy from any market. There was a thought that haunted me in quieter shifts. Perhaps you can unmake what you paid for if you pay differently. Perhaps debts can be transferred, rewritten in a language the warp will accept. Perhaps you can go back. To say that aloud is to tempt the sort of trouble men in our position are taught to avoid. To turn back toward a lane you have forced once is to call the attention of things that keep count. But to leave a companion hollow is to accept a verdict of your own making. I had seen the way the Navigator flinched at slivers of starlight. I had felt the psyker's hands at my shoulder and known the measure of loss. Command had taught me to bear burdens. It had not taught me how to be forgiven for the ones you choose. We refueled at port. We scrubbed the hull and filed the mandatory logs. The officials signed their stamps and moved on to less interesting business. The crew took their pay and drank as if to drown the taste of ash. The Navigator refused any formal audience with the magistrate and accepted instead a bench near the engine fore, near the place the ship breathed. He traced the charts with a finger, not understanding the lines so much as remembering their shape, which is to say he was learning to live around the absence. When the tide turned and the ship's prow was raised again to the black, I made a choice that left no room for easy absolution. I set our heading not for the warm harbor and its safe contracts, but for that smear of star space where the seam had been bruised open. It was a small thing to do in terms of distance, and an enormous thing in terms of consequence. The engines complained, the crew asked questions with thin voices. I answered with the kind of quiet certainty that carries class where rhetoric cannot. We were going back. There are reasons captains do not admit such things. They do not want to bring the discipline of law on their heads. They do not want to risk the contagion of condemnation spreading through a crew already half made of whispers. They do not want to find out that the Navigator's silence is contagious, or that the Psyker's offering was the only true bulwark between them and a worse thing. None of that knowledge stopped me. Command had taught me to weigh the ledger. Humanity had taught me to be greedy for whatever we had taken. So the course was set. The Navigator watched the stars folding themselves into the familiar longhand of our maps and, in a voice like paper sliding over stone, said my name. It was a test. It was a question. It was not forgiveness. It was not accusation either. It was the sound of a man present at the seat of a decision and waiting to see if his hand would be chosen. I replied by tilting my hand toward the helm and starting the slow process of unwinding a different spool of fate. The engines spun, the ship leaned, and the Geller hum regained a thin edge, cautious and skeptical. The lane ahead would not be a mirror of the last. Nothing ever is. But intention is a fuel of its own kind, and we had found enough of it to move. We were going to the place where we had bought our passage, with the bill unpaid and the ink still wet. We were going to find what remained of that living piece, and to see if, by some cruel, improbable mercy, it could be returned, or at least honored. We were going back to a wound we had opened, and I knew the wound would open wider for our return. I also knew that to continue carrying the secret of what we had done without trying to make it right would be to rot from the inside out. So we angled toward the dark, knowing that to seek restitution was to invite vengeance or salvation in measure equal and opposite. The crew tightened belts and shared looks that were half prayer and half defiance. Behind us, the port withdrew into a scatter of lights. Ahead, the lane waited like a promise that is also a threat. We moved,